All right, and then I'm going to hit start webinar and we'll be good to go. So let's give everyone a couple minutes to get in.
All right, it looks like we've slowed down with the folks coming in, so I'm going to suggest we get started here. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matthew Taylor, and I'm an Associate Dean here at UM St. Louis in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm also an Associate Professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences. Welcome to the 2022 Great Decision Speaker Series, an initiative of the Foreign Policy Association, sponsored locally by the World Affairs Council of St. Louis and UMSL Global, the international office at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. UMSL Global has been partnered and a sponsor of the speaker series for many years, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. The World Affairs Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with local chapters across the United States. It is a member-based organization that connects each local chapter with the world. The World Affairs Council of St. Louis is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization founded in 1948. As I said earlier, the mission is to offer programs which promote understanding, engagement, relationships, and leadership in world affairs. They rely on donations from the community and have annual memberships available. And you can see in the chat there, we have put the link for more information about that. I'm really excited about our speaker today. I have been a closet stan and fan of Dr. Ness Sandoval, who comes to us from St. Louis University. I've actually tracked his work since I got here in St. Louis. It ties in with some of mine. It's very fascinating. He's been conducting research at the intersection of demographic techniques and computational spatial science to study the spatial hierarchy of inequality in American cities. He has also been working in the emerging fields of forensic GI science, geographic information sciences, social environmental synthesis, and the applications of spatial, temporal, multi-scaled spatial and conditional autoregressive models to study social, economic, and environmental patterns of inequality. He recently founded 2 geospatial applied community projects, Demography for Democracy and Coding for Spatial Justice. Both projects are designed to empower community members to envision the future they want for their neighborhoods and acquire the resources to make their visions happen. Professor Sandoval is the Associate Director of the Geospatial Institute at SLU, co-director of the PhD program in Public and Social Policy, and the director of the MS Sociology program. So there are multiple hats this man wears. So how we're going to do this is Dr. Sandoval is going to give us some presentation here, and then we'll have time at the end for Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature on the Zoom here, and then we'll be able to extrapolate and pull those questions out and offer them up. We'll have some different folks monitoring those, and we're going to make sure we leave sufficient time at the end for some rich discussion built upon what I'm already sure is going to be a fabulous presentation. So with that, I will turn my camera off, and Dr. Sandoval, please take us away.
Thank you, Matt, for a very nice introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this speaker series. Today's topic is titled Changing Demographics. And the idea here is, how do we study our future? How do we get a sense of what our future looks like using data from our past? So I have essentially 4 themes to the talk I want to present today. The first theme is just to spend a few minutes talking about the idea of demographic momentum and why this allows us to get a sense of what a potential future may look like. And then really spend some time talking about the empirical reality of what's happening around the world and here in the United States and locally around births and deaths. Talk a little bit about the US Census that was released this past year, and then talk a little bit about migration. So the first concept here is demographic momentum. And I'd like to use this quote that I typically use when I give a talk that has lots of facts and figures. The great principle of demography is that demographic transitions will happen even if people refuse to believe or acknowledge the trends or facts. And so the idea of this quote is that when we talk about births, deaths, and migrations, oftentimes you may hear people say that we want to stop it. We need policy to stop this. And that's one type of a discussion. But what's unique about demography is that when we look at our information, we see that they're fairly stable. And because they're stable, it provides us a lens into the future. And so people will probably say, well, I don't like my future. And my response is, you may not like your future, but this is probably what the future is going to look like given our births, deaths, and migration patterns. So demography, the field of demography was born around 1950, pre-1850. There were several studies that had a demographic component to it, but it was about 1850 when the field was formalized. And there are 3 core demographic transitions that we look at. The first demographic transition is births. The second is death, and the third is migration. Now, 2 of these, birth and deaths, are what we call natural demographic transitions. So we know that we were all born and we will all die. So these are demographic facts. The third one is migration, right? So migration, people decide to move. Could be based on social policy, could be based on economic needs or social needs, but you have the freedom to move, or you may be forced to move. And so these are the 3 demographic transitions that we tend to say that these are the core demographic transitions that will lead to subsequent transitions that will happen in the city, will happen in rural areas. You can measure these at the state level, at the country level, but we typically start out with these 3 demographic transitions. And so these are the 3 that I'm going to focus on, and I'm going to move into some core analyses when we get into the US Census. But when we think about this concept of demography as demographic momentum, almost every day you can pick up a newspaper article that talks about this idea. And so this was released March 17th, which is today of 2020. And it talks about the demographic momentum in Japan. And so if you've been studying Japan and been following one of the biggest debates in that country, it has to do with the falling birth rates that are there in an aging society. And so this is one example where this is not new, actually. We've known about this trend since the 1970s. And so Japan has developed a series of policies to try to reverse this trend. However, the trend continues. This is one example here. Russia is in the same example. It's in the news today for the invasion of Ukraine and so forth. But pre-Ukraine, it was in the news for other reasons, and it had to do with the demographic collapse of Russia. And again, it's very similar to Japan's statistics. This is not new. We've had this information for about 2 decades, And Russia they are trying to turn these trends around with little success. China's been in the news over the past year because they have changed their policy. They understand that they have a demographic challenge for the country. They have an aging society. They weren't having enough children to support that aging society. And so in the past year, I believe it was last May, China announced a 3-child policy to try to increase the number of babies that were born in China. And so when that announcement was made, there was a big promotion to encourage families to have at least 3 children. Another example we find more locally here in the United States is our country, the United States, and cities throughout the United States are becoming more and more diverse. There are many reasons why we're becoming diverse, but with that diversity, it's putting tremendous pressure on our demographic categories that we use. And so we are starting to see, and this happened, actually this movement started under President George Bush Jr., and it was the discussion and policy change actually happened under President Obama, was the creation of new racial classifications for the census. Under the Trump administration, that policy was rescinded and the categories remained consistent to the 2010 categories. However, there have been some changes actually over the past 2 weeks in which people are putting pressure on the Biden administration to actually change these categories to better reflect the diversity of the United States and giving people the option to identify and imagine themselves as how they see themselves fitting into the racial ethnic fabric of the United States. And so this is a topic I'll talk about in the census, and I'm happy to answer questions from the audience on this topic because it's such a new topic that's going to impact our country. And then we know that immigration plays a very important role in the US social fabric. And I'll talk a little bit about this in my presentation here, is we see that there has been a decline in fertility. There's an increase in mortality in the United States. And so we'll talk about this concept of natural growth. And we'll see that immigrants are actually a very important component of the growth here in the United States. And so this provides a very quick introduction to demographic momentum. Some of these topics that we're going to talk about are not new. We've been talking about these for many, many decades. Some of them are important because we're developing policy to think about how we try to track these trends. So the way I kind of organize this presentation is around 10 demographic facts, both at the world level and at the local level. And so the first fact I want to talk about are births and deaths. And so what we just know at the world level is that we're having fewer babies. This is a chart that shows the decline in fertility at the world level here, and it starts in 1950. And we can see where we're at in 2020. And the projection is that we'll continue to see a decline in fertility for the next 30 years or so. So why is this happening? We know that fertility is highly correlated with education. It's also highly correlated with an urban population. And so we have more and more residents throughout the world that are living in urban centers. And if you live in urban centers, they tend to be more expensive, and that causes families to be smaller. People are starting to, they're getting married at a later age. And we're seeing a trend that started a couple decades ago that people are choosing to stay single, not get married, and not have children. And so this is simply not a US phenomenon, but this is happening globally. So this is one demographic fact that fertility is declining. A second demographic fact is we're starting to see an aging population. And so we're expecting to see an increase in the number of people who are dying in the next 30 years. And we'll see that this is going to really change by which region of the world that we're looking at. So a very common demographic measure that we use is called a rate of natural increase. And one of the assumptions in demography is that populations always grow. And so we always have more babies being born than people dying. And so for the US, that trend is true, but we see that the gap between births and deaths is starting to get smaller here. And so the question, so when I took my first demography class in the early 1990s, it was never a question whether this was going to change. This was always going to be our working assumptions. But now we start to realize that this is changing, and we're starting to see us having to evolve and use different language. And I'll talk about this in just a few seconds here. So this is the rate of natural increase. So this is how many new individuals are we adding to the planet's population. And so you can see over time, starting roughly here about 1984, even though the population of the world is growing, we're growing at a smaller rate. And so we're going to see the rate of natural increase start to go down. So even though we're increasing, we're not increasing as fast. And so the analogy I like to use when I talk about this concept is thinking of a car. And if you have a car that's going 50 miles an hour and you hit the brakes, that car is still going to go. That's demographic momentum. It's still going to grow. But if a car is only going 2 miles an hour and you hit the brakes, it's probably going to come to a stop. And it may even go back a little bit, right, in reverse. And so that's just kind of the idea of the rate of natural increase. So what I want to do here is just kind of focus on countries now in terms of what's happening around the world at a country level. And so we see that we have countries that are, if we take this analogy of a car going 50 miles an hour, we have countries that are still producing lots of births, lots of babies being born in these countries. And these countries tend to be located in Africa, right? So these tremendous population growth that's happening here. But if we look at the flip side of population that's dying, we tend to see another part of the world that's experiencing high death rates. And this tends to be Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. We do have 3 countries in Africa, and this is primarily driven by the AIDS epidemic that's there. So what we do is we look at the birth rate, death rates to get a sense of how fast each country is growing. And so the first part of this is simply to look at the sub-regions of the world in terms of how fast they're growing. And so we see that Middle Africa is actually the fastest growing region in the world at a natural increase of 3.4, followed by Western Africa, Eastern Africa, and then Oceania, Central Asia, and so forth. But then we see that we have some sub-regions of the world that actually have negative rate of a natural, it's a rate of natural decrease. And so this is new language for demographers, right? Because we kind of always assume that there would be an increase. And so these are the countries that are actually experiencing a natural decline. So when I was in my demography class, this was kind of theoretical. We knew that there were some countries that were there, but we didn't expect this to be a very long list of countries. Now there are 30 countries that are actually experiencing a rate of natural decline, which means that there are more people that are dying than are being born. And again, we see that these are mostly in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe here. And then if we look at the rate of natural increase, we see these are the countries that tend to be in Africa. And so that's the first demographic fact that I want to present, is that this concept of rate of natural increase and decrease is very important in terms of helping us explain a demographic transition. Now I want to talk a little bit about this concept of a demographic shock. And so we are living through a demographic shock as we speak. And what's important about demographic shocks is that they tend to have a very immediate impact on births and deaths. So the birth and deaths tend to be relatively stable in most countries. But there could be some external shock that impacts that transition, and therefore we see an unexpected increase or decline in births and deaths. And so we've seen this here with COVID. So this is a chart from Flowing Data that's tracking, this is here for the United States, that's tracking births and deaths here in the United States from about 2003. And so for the most part, births and deaths are fairly predictable in the United States by month. we do see we had some bad months here when we look at deaths of influenza and pneumonia. And there was one peak where we almost had more people dying than being born. But then if you start to look at this period of the pandemic, we clearly see that our birth and death transitions were fairly unstable. And there are some moments where for specific months where it appears that we had more people dying than were being born in the United States. So what we've been doing is kind of studying how unprecedented is this COVID pandemic to fairly stable demographic processes. And so this is simply the absolute change in death from the previous year. And so if you go back to 2000, we see for the most part, deaths have been fairly stable. There's some variation, as you would see when you had a bad flu and pneumonia season, but they were not excessive. But we get to 2020 and we see that something fundamentally changed in the United States, and that we experienced more than 500,000 excessive deaths to the US total population. And so this was a very important moment in demographic history in the United States, because you need to ask, is this a temporary process, or is this something that's going to happen for 3 to 5 years, or is this something permanent that we can expect? So another way to think about this is when we have a rate of natural increase, we can do this per day. And so for the most part, we can see by year, the United States was doing pretty good in terms of adding people to the population, simply from more babies being born than people dying. But I think the trend was pretty clear that the rate of natural increase per day was going down. So in 2017, it was about 2,800. 2018, it was 2,600. In 2019, it was 2,400. But now we get down to 2020 and we see the rate of natural increase is 630. And so this, when we get the 21 data, we want to see if this is a concerning problem, because some people are looking at this latest data point and have raised the issue that this is probably, if this continues, could be a national security concern for the United States. Because this is what's happening in some of these Eastern European countries, where you're seeing a demographic collapse of processes, for the most that were fairly stable, but that are collapsing. And they're collapsing because of COVID here. So to take that graph, I'm showing you the gap here, and you can see that the net population growth per hour in the United States, we had reached a high of 2016 since 1990. And it was going down every year, but you can clearly see from 2019 to 2020, a complete collapse of the natural increase of the US population. And it's primarily driven by COVID that's impacting excessive deaths, but it's also had an impact on the number of babies being born. And so when you have a demographic shock, it impacts our two core demographic transitions, fertility and mortality. And so at one end, you see excessive deaths, but at the other end, you have people who are waiting and postponing having babies because they want some sense of certainty of what the future looks like. So what has happened is, again, this was a concept that was introduced. It's a fairly old concept, a demographic winter, and was mostly meant to talk about what was happening in Eastern Europe and in countries like Japan and so forth. But the demographic winter has come to the United States. And so now we have about 25 states that are in a demographic winter, which means that there are more people dying than babies being born. And we knew about this. This was not new. We had several states in the Northeast, West Virginia, that are in a permanent demographic winter. There's very little evidence that they're going to get out of a demographic winter. So this was a normal state of demographic transitions for these states. But what's new are the states here in the light red, and this is all driven by COVID. And so we're here in Missouri, and Missouri is one of these states that reported a demographic winter and is still in a demographic winter as we speak. And so as a demographer, we're like, Missouri should not be in a demographic winter. We're about 10 years too early. But the point of a demographic shock is that when you have vulnerable populations it can push you into different categories. And so that's what's happened in a state like Missouri, Tennessee, Florida, and so forth. That these were states that were close, but it just took one demographic shock to change demographic transitions that are there. So when we start to look at the data underneath these states, we start to see that the demographic winter is having an impact on certain groups. And so we look at one group, white Americans, and we see that since prior to 2016, we started to see that more white Americans were dying than were being born. But what we've seen since 2016 is that number has been increasing every year. And then the pandemic really saw an increase for the white population in a demographic winter. Again, this was projected, this is not new. But I think what is new is the magnitude of the demographic deficit of the number of whites that are dying than are being born. And it's going to be very difficult to reverse this number, primarily because of the age structure of the white population in the United States relative to the number of babies being born. And I have a slide that will demonstrate this in more detail. So this is something that's going to be very difficult to reverse. What's really changed in the past year is that there are only 5 states now in the United States where more whites are being born than are dying. In 2019, there were 12 states where more whites were being born and that were dying. And one of the states that's I'll just point out that's shocking is Texas. And so if you've been following Texas, it's a very important state. It had a growing white population, but then the pandemic came, and now we see that more whites are dying than are being born in Texas. And we want to keep a track on this because Texas is one of the few states where you have positive white migration to the state. And so even with that positive white migration to the state, we're still seeing, at least for this year, more whites dying than are being born in the state of Texas. It's to the point in some of the work that we've done, because the difference between the white population in Texas and the Latino population in Texas is about 100,000. And so it is possible, as we speak right now, that the Latino population is larger than the white population in the state of Texas, especially given the news that was released last week that there was an undercount of 5% of the Latino population. So if we kind of ignore that news, simply just based on births alone, I'll show you here in a couple of minutes, that the Latino population is going to surpass the white population based on birth and death transitions in the state of Texas. Demographic spring. So not everybody's in a demographic winter. The Latino population is actually in a demographic spring. And so every year, more Latinos are born than are dying. That number is going down. And partly this is we see a huge decline in fertility because of COVID, but we're still seeing about 600,000 Latinos are added to the population every year simply from births over deaths. And then every state in the United States is experiencing a positive increase in the Latino population. And so you'll see here that Texas is number 2 in the United States. So about 120,000 Latinos are being added to Texas every year simply from births. And so when we look at that deficit that was from the 2020 census, it's going to be erased here in the next couple of years. And so this is going to be an important story that's going to be told over the next decade. Demographic number 5, demography's destiny. So this is a concept where some people will take it back 150 years. Other people will talk about it more recently, but the point here is we can get a pretty good sense of what's happening towards the future based on the techniques that we have to measure demographic change today. And so I'm going to present 2 sets of data here, one from the 2020 to 2010 census, and then the 2010 to 2020 census. So we kind of already knew from the 2000 to 2010 census that the Latino population was accounting for the majority of the growth in the United States. So this was something that was projected and it happened. And so we kind of knew that this trend was going to continue, and it's going to continue up for the next 20 to 30 years. But what the recent census showed was that indeed Latinos are still growing, followed by a category multi-race. And so we can talk about this in the Q&A about why this group has experienced such a huge increase in this period. But what we experienced and analyzing our data is that there was actually a fairly significant decline in the white alone population, about 5 million individuals. And so if you look at that 20-year period, you can see about 27 million Latinos were added to the US population. And then we see followed by non-Hispanic Asians, multiracial non-Hispanic Blacks, and then we do see a decline over this 20-year period of about 2.8 million white non-Hispanics. So another way to kind of visualize this chart, just to kind of give you a sense of the proportionality of how important the Latino population is to a growing United States. Again, that this previous census was actually signaling that the United States population as a whole is slowing down, but there are subcomponents of the population that are experiencing growth. So I want to talk a little bit about St. Louis. And so St. Louis is no longer really experiencing the growth that some of the other regions are experiencing. It was about 1.2%. It lost white population, it lost some Black populations, and it saw some moderate increase in the Latino population here. And so we can see that overall the white population declined. When we break it down by age, we see some interesting breakdowns where we see under 18, a decline in the African-American population. And so we're looking forward to this data that's going to be released in April, and that should provide some data on households. And so if this number is suggesting something, it's suggesting that Black families are leaving the St. Louis metropolitan region along with white families as well. So demographic fact number 7 is that there's some interesting trends when we look at components of growth. And I want to look at this simply for this presentation through the lens of the racial classifications that we use from the US Census. And so if we look at the fastest components of growth in the United States, we can see of the 20 fastest components of growth at the state level, 14 of them are driven by Latino population. And so that's Texas, California, and Florida are the fastest growths of the population are Latino. And then we have California again, represented by the Asian population. Texas then is represented again by the Asian population. And then you see Texas again is represented by the Black population. And so this is a very important analysis that shows you that the racial minority populations are contributing to the growing population in these states. But the majority of those components of growth are coming from the Latino population. Now, if we look at the fastest components of state population decline, we can see that all of the states that are experiencing decline are experiencing a decline in the white population. Followed is New York, California, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, just to name some examples are here. And so part of this is due to births over deaths. Part of it is due to whites moving out of the state. Other parts could be that we'll talk about it. We can talk about it in the Q&A of how the census asked this question. There are only 16 states that experienced the white population growth: Utah, Colorado, South Carolina, Florida, Texas, Idaho. And then we can do an analysis within the metropolitan regions, like where are they going in these regions. Utah and Colorado is driven largely by the Mormon population. South Carolina, Florida, and Texas is also driven by migration. The 20 fastest components of state growth for the Black population, we see that the Black population is growing. The 3 largest states are in the South: Texas, Georgia, and Florida. But we also see Minnesota experiencing growth, Maryland experiencing growth, North Carolina experiencing growth as well. And then we do the same analysis for the Asian population. California, Texas, New York are the largest components of change for the Asian population. So this gives us a sense of what's happening here. Now, the next set of slides I want to present are at the metropolitan level. And so if we just look at the top 50, the top largest 50 metropolitan regions in the United States, we see that of those 50, 46 of them, the Latino population in absolute numbers grew faster than the white population. In 47 of these regions, the Latino population grew faster than the Black population. And in 41% of those regions, the Latino population grew faster than the Asian population. So if you're a region that wants to grow, one element of that growth has to be an increase in your Latino population. So when we start to look at this in more detail, we see that there's some cities that have some what we call a demographic hurdle. And a demographic hurdle is a challenge that you're trying to overcome, but it's very difficult because you'd have to deal with those three demographic transitions: birth, deaths, and migration. And so these are the set of cities that have experienced a loss in the white population and a loss in the Black population. And you'll see that St. Louis is one of these select cities here that has experienced a loss in the white population of 105,000 and a loss in the Black population of about 10,000. But the other cities tend to be are Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and Detroit here. And so these are cities, when we start to do our analysis, are cities that have a historical record of high segregation in the cities. And so there's some evidence that's saying that the African-American population is now looking to find and live the American dream in other cities. And then we see a lot of the other cities are Fresno, San Diego, San Jose, Los Angeles, San Francisco, which tend to be California, and New York, which tend to be cities that are extremely, have high cost of living here. And so this is something that we want to pay attention to over the next decade, especially if you're in the St. Louis metropolitan region and you're trying to develop a region that can be competitive to other regions. It'll be very difficult if your two largest populations are leaving, which is the white and Black population. If they're leaving this region in large numbers, it's going to be very difficult for St. Louis to maintain its competitiveness from a demographic perspective, because there simply aren't enough Latinos to offset the loss that's happening there. Let's have a few more slides and then we can open it up for discussion. So I alluded to this slide earlier on in my presentation. And so this is about demographic momentum. So the question is, well, how do we know what the future looks like? Well, we know that birth rates in the United States and death rates are fairly stable. They don't change dramatically. And so what we do is we develop a population pyramid. And we know every 5 years about how many people will die in each of these groups. And so what we see here is a Latino population pyramid in which the three largest age cohorts are 10 to 14, 5 to 9, and 0 to 4, right? And then the largest age cohorts for the white population are 60 to 64, 55 to 59, and 65 to 69. And so what we do is that we just simply move these cohorts forward for 20 years and a certain percentage will die. And eventually what we'll see if we do a 20-year analysis is that for the Latino population, the 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and 10 to 14-year-olds, these are individuals who will be entering college, forming families, and having children. And the Latinos have a slightly higher fertility rate than the white population. But a large percentage of the white population are going to be entering into the transition of mortality. And so, and we don't see in that cohort a very large 0 to 4 cohort relative to the overall age structure of the white population. And so this is a cohort for the Latino population. This structure, this cohort represents a developing country. And so if you go back to the world trends and you look at countries that are in a demographic spring, this is what that population pyramid looks like. And so we have one population that's in a demographic spring, the Latino population. And then we have one population that's in the demographic winter, and that's the white population. And so that's what that age cohort looks like. And then we have an objective measure that actually says, well, how different are the age groups between Latinos and whites? And the age difference is 0.20. And so that's pretty significant difference between the white and Latino population. This story is almost true for every state in the United States, every city in the United States. And depending on the city, the magnitude of difference is actually even greater. We have some cities where the index of the similarity is on the order of 0.40 between the white and Latino population. So extreme age differences in these cities here. So I just want to talk a little bit about immigration. So that's that third component. So this is a chart that just shows the trend of immigrants in the United States. And we can see for the most part, it was leveling off under the previous administration here. And I don't see, even we'll talk a little bit about what's happening around the world today with refugees. I don't see a huge significant change here in terms of adding 10 to 50 more immigrants to the United States. The largest immigrant group is the Mexican immigrant group, followed by China, India, and the Philippines. And so that's been fairly consistent. I don't expect that to be relatively big changes over the next decade. In terms of where the immigrants are going, the number one, in terms of percent foreign born, Miami has the largest percent foreign born in the United States, followed by Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, and Houston. So some of the work we do here with the St. Louis Mosaic Project is trying to track how St. Louis does compared to the top 20 metropolitan regions. And so you can see the latest data that we have from the one-year estimates show that we're not doing pretty good right now. We were actually dead last in terms of the growth of the foreign-born population compared to cities that we want to be like. But what's interesting is that when we look at this at the state level, we look at it at the city level, we do see that there are cities that are having a tremendous impact in incorporating and welcoming immigrants to the region. So people are quite surprised that the fourth largest immigrant population in Missouri is actually in Chesterfield. And then we see that Maryland Heights is there, O'Fallon, Malville, University City. So at the city level, we see that immigrants are actually living in some of these cities, especially here on the St. Louis side. And then we have a formula that we use to calculate immigrant destinations. And so we see that Maryland Heights is an immigrant destination, Chesterfield City is an immigrant destination, Malville, Afton are immigrant destinations in the region. So even though our numbers are relatively small, we're starting to see concentrations in certain municipalities in the region. And this is the slide that just shows the St. Louis region was doing relatively good each year after 2014. And then when after 2018, we see a small decline in our immigrant population. So I just want to quickly wrap up at the final slide here. So one of the themes that we want to take away from all these numbers is that the concept of a demographic winter is real. It's impacting many countries in Europe. And because of COVID, it's impacting at least half of our states now. And so we're starting to see it impact subgroups of our population, especially populations who self-identify as white. The second theme is that there is an opposite trend that's happening, and that's a demographic spring. And so populations are growing because more people are being born than are dying. And this is happening in several countries in Africa. And we see it happening here in the United States with the Latino population. Oops. The third theme of this presentation is that international migration is very important to the diversity of the United States. And then we can talk about what this means to the changing categories that the US Census is using. And then lastly, I didn't spend that much time on migration around the world, but I talked about the demographic shock of COVID. But what we're seeing today is that demographic shocks can happen because of war. And this happened with Syria, and it's happening here in Ukraine. And so what happens in our numbers is that we need to make a distinction between immigrants who are individuals who are leaving because they want to experience the immigrant experience, and individuals who are leaving because they are refugees. They have been misplaced because of violence in their country. And so this is something it's an ongoing story. I'm not sure how it ends, but there's roughly about 3 million refugees in the past 2.5 weeks from Ukraine that are being resettled in Poland and other parts of Europe. And so with that, I will be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thanks, Ness. That was wonderful. You can probably stop sharing so we can have bigger images. Mostly of you, not so much of me, though.
Sure.
Fantastic. So I just remind folks, please, if you have questions or comments and want to continue the dialogue here, please use the Q&A feature of the Zoom here. And we have a couple questions already coming in, so I'll just read those. Does the white in-migration into Texas actually increase the death rate? You now have people dying that were not born in the state.
That could be a possibility. So the 2020 data just got released this morning, like at 9 o'clock. So it is possible that that's a possibility. We do know that one of the largest groups of people, whites, who are moving to Texas are from California. And so that could explain part of it. But when we were doing the analysis at the city level, you had cities like Austin that actually was one of the few cities that experienced an increase in the white population. And that's young professionals that were moving there for jobs. And so I think it's both, probably both of them are contributing to the story there. But I just think from the CDC data, we just know that there's just an excessive number of deaths that are happening in Texas that was not projected there 2 years ago. And so something happened in the past 18 months where for whatever reason, you see more whites that are dying than were projected.
And isn't that a universal, a national piece too? If I'm thinking back to looking at some of the data, again, I'm no expert, I'm just trying to ask you a question. In terms of the declining white life expectancy for whites we've seen over the last 4 or 5, maybe 6 years, COVID, opioid, alcoholism, suicides, and there's a collection of those, I forget what the term was, but there's a collection of those deaths that have really been endemic to whites, and the decline in life expectancy has been pretty remarkable.
This is actually a very good point, because the white population was actually growing up until the opioid epidemic. That was really the demographic tipping point, where we started to see more whites dying than are being born. This was about 2012. And we're like, well, it was a small number, but we're like, well, it's just going to be temporary. But it has never reversed since the opioid epidemic. The deficit has gotten larger and larger every year. And so I think it is a combination of factors that's happening. There's two sides to this equation. One is deaths, and then the other side is births, though, because births have also fallen pretty dramatically. And I think when we analyzed the 2008 recession, we saw this. We saw the people didn't die, but we saw a decline in births. And I think we were all wrong. I think in retrospect, we were all wrong, because we said, well, births were going to come back. People were scared of the recession, like, what's going on? I'm not going to have a baby. I mean, we all assumed like everybody was going to come back and have babies. That never happened. We recovered economically as a country. We never recovered demographically. And so when these other factors started to hit the certain populations, they were at a lower starting point that nobody had projected, because everybody had projected fertility is going to come back. And then you have other factors beyond just the deaths. Is you have, what does it mean to live the American dream? And so oftentimes the American dream of people that are going to college in 2022 is very different than 2008. You're like, well, you have college loans now that just 30 years ago just didn't exist in the magnitude they exist today. And so there's a lot of demographic theories that talk about how people who want to live that dream will start to say, well, instead of 3 children, I'm going to have 1 child because I have a college loan to pay. Trying to buy a house in some of these markets, we did a quick analysis because this fertility actually corresponds very closely to housing prices in certain regions. And so I saw a story on USA Today that the number of cities that had the average housing price was 1 million. And I'm like, okay, in those cities, you're going to see a decline in fertility. And that's exactly what you're seeing. Like in those cities where the housing market is so hot, people are like, we can't have children. And so it's a combination of factors. Daycare is very expensive. The states have retreated in tuition and subsidizing tuition. And so in many ways, we have policies that are driving down fertility indirectly. And I think for some people, it's an uncomfortable conversation to have because it's like, when they ask me, well, what would you do? And I'm like, well, I would get rid of student loans. I would just wipe them all out. If fertility is really the most important question, just wipe out student loans because then you'll see an immediate increase in fertility, especially among white population, because that's who's being impacted the most by the student loans.
When you talk about people, there's more questions I want to get to. I want to follow up on one point though. When you talk about people leaving places like California and going to these other locations, is it purely economic? My money goes further if I sell a house in California and move into Texas, or I'm thinking of white flight from South Africa after apartheid fell.
I think it's a combination of both. But okay. What's interesting about California, it's not only whites who are leaving California. Mexicans are also leaving California. And they're going to places like Utah City, Denver, Colorado, Phoenix, Arizona. And so you can't just say it's just one group of people. It's multiple. It's very. You see the slide there with the African Americans leaving. There is an element of the cost of living in some of these cities is very high, and you can go to a place like Houston, Orlando, Atlanta, and for now you can still have a decent sized home, not a very outstanding mortgage, and live the American dream. It doesn't have the racial discrimination that Chicago, Milwaukee have in terms of the spatial patterns of inequality.
Gotcha. And sadly, Denver's probably moved off that list in terms of affordable housing.
Yeah, Denver's gone, yeah.
Here's another great question. There's some really good questions here. We'll get to these. Isn't population decline a good thing for climate change? So energy demands will go down.
Oh, so we talk about the world total. That's one of the themes that we're going to be using less resources. So this is a hard question because it's a very complicated question. Because if you look at where the population is growing, these tend to be countries where the economy is not developed. And so it's hard for me to go into a country and saying, don't tear down that rainforest because we need that rainforest if they don't have a developed economy, right? And so it is a good thing if the economy is developed and you're using sustainable resources. But if it's a country where the population is growing faster than the economy, then you're going to be using resources and maybe not in a sustainable way. I think that's the challenge. And so this is where you get into more complicated. Well, then what are the mechanisms for education? What's the role of advanced economies to come in and help these countries develop opportunities? You'll see when we look at, I didn't present it here, but when we look at migration data, it's the countries that have more babies than people dying. They don't have enough jobs. And so people are leaving because they want to survive. You want to survive. These are countries that they fall under the theme of food and water insecurity. And so they're looking for a sustainable life. And so that leads to migration. And so, yeah, having a declining population in theory is going to reduce resources, but it's not evenly distributed throughout the world. And we're going to see that people are going to use resources in an unsustainable way to meet that growing population need.
Great, thank you. And of course, the 5 o'clock flights are coming in, so you'll hear them flying over as I ask the next question here up from UMSL's campus. Are the deaths counted, all deaths or natural causes? How do the increasing violence rates fit into this?
So that death rates from CDC, that's all deaths. So that's coming from CDC. So and those are official deaths that have an official death certificate attached to them. And so I don't, at least for this presentation, I don't get into the cause of deaths because of what's happened over the past 18 about what can you really attribute this to COVID, or did they die from obesity and not COVID? So I don't get into that debate. I'd rather just stay at the larger level and saying that something fundamentally changed in the past 18 months, that we had an excess of death of 600,000 Americans. And 2021, those official counts are happening as we speak. I think more people are going to die in 2021 than 2020, officially. And so, yeah, it's going to be a combination of homicides, of opioids, of COVID-related illnesses. So I think the hope is in 2022, we're starting to see reported deaths go down a little bit. But we're still living through this pandemic. So I kind of track this. I'm like, we're not wearing masks anymore, and we're kind of going back to a regular form of life. But when you start to look at the death tracker, you're like, wow, the deaths are still pretty high. And we're not saying it's from COVID, but we're just like, is this the new norm? And I think if this is the new norm, like we've accepted that we're going to have 3.5 million deaths a year. And I think that's a pretty sad statement as a country, because we should not be there. We should be under 3 million deaths a year. But if we've kind of accepted that, we're okay with 3.5 million deaths, then to me, that's something that as a demographer, like that was not projected. That was never in our projections 3 or 4 years ago. But now we have to include that new number into our projections.
As you extend this notion into policy, can you talk a little bit about how the role of federal intervention, such as a broad-ranging healthcare system, could help with these numbers versus the entrepreneurial system that we have now? One where it's more socialized or something like that. I know that's a political hot button, though. But if we actually talk about policies, we're not a prevention-based culture, and a lot of this is an access to healthcare issue. How do you think some of these numbers would inform people's discussions about policy to alleviate these outcomes?
I do think that part of so when you start to look at the excess of deaths, I think the question is, how much of those excess of deaths could have been prevented? So that gets into the question of vaccine, who had access. We have students who are working in our lab that shows that there's a pretty significant difference between those who lived in urban areas and those who did not live in urban areas. And I suspect when we get these numbers for 2021, we're going to show a lot of the excess of deaths came from rural America. And we have a category, it's called RUCA. But we're looking at the category 9, which is these are the extremely rural areas. And we're hypothesizing that these categories that were extremely disconnected from an urban network of healthcare and information were probably the most vulnerable counties in the United States. And so I think that there's probably some element here where, for whatever reason, it got politicized and people think whatever it is, we're starting to see it in the CDC numbers. And I just raised Texas as an example because Texas should not be in that category, because it's such a unique state that people are moving there in large numbers. It's one of the few states where you can say whites are moving to, but yet it's got more people dying than are being born. Kind of tells you, and you understand that they had a different adoption of mask policy there. And I think we're starting to see, well, that's the result of what that, and same with Florida as well.
Thank you. Are there differences in average fertility rates based on how long a population has been in the US? For example, do first-gen immigrants have higher birth rates than those who have been in the United States for generations?
Absolutely. So yeah, so there is research, and we showed in our work that fertility rates come down. So the longer you're in the United States, and it's highly correlated with income and education. And so you'll see these fertility rates come down. And so most most immigrants who come to the United States, they're coming to the United States to live the American dream. And so the fertility rates are coming down. And so I think one of the I'll talk about it just right now. I think one of the shocks that where people start to see the Latina fertility rate come down is it's coming down pretty fast. And we've kind of always assumed like, well, we always have the Latino population to rely on because it's growing. Well, it's growing, but the growth is coming down every year because the fertility rates is starting to come down. Now it's still above replacement level. So they're still having quite a few babies. But one can imagine in 10 years from now, it could be below replacement level. And it could look very closer to what the African-American population looks like.
Right, and another question here. Vietnamese, Bosnians, Afghans, and other groups have contributed to much of our region in the face of population decline. Could you conjecture, predict the demographic impact of the war in Ukraine for immigration to St. Louis area? Are we aware of preparations being made to encourage new immigrants here?
So I think generally speaking that I think everybody understand every city. Well, let me be a little bit. There are many cities in the United States who are welcoming refugees to their city because we know that population growth is declining, and population's power. And so if you can't get it from births over deaths, you got to get it from immigrations. And when we talk about immigrants who come in, like immigrants who are intentional, like they're an immigrant, they know what city they're going to. They're going to New York, they're going to Miami, they're going to Los Angeles. But refugees are different on the other hand. Refugees are going to cities where this is where they have an opportunity to come to. And so a lot of cities are stepping up and saying, we want to be home to the Afghanis. We want to be home to the Syrians. We want to be home to, because they realize that they're not a destination city for immigrants. And so I would say, yeah, there is the potential for St. Louis to be a destination for Ukrainians who come to the United States. I think the question is, this is another topic, but is there enough housing actually in the region to incorporate all of the numbers that you would want? And so if you've been looking at the city of St. Louis, for example, like there are parts of the city that are just not, that are very expensive to live in now. There are other parts of the city where the housing is not sustainable to live. And so there's probably a cap on how many you could bring in, given that we're the 21st largest metropolitan region in the United States based on population, but we're almost near, I think we're in the top 40 in terms of housing starts. We have a gap between where we want to be and the housing that's available for people to come. And so I just saw a statistic about a week ago on housing starts. I'm like, St. Louis is not even in that discussion, even though we're the 21st largest metro region in the United States. Our real estate indicators indicate that we're not even in, we're going to probably fall in the top 50 when we talk about housing. So you have to have housing for people to come and live. So I would hope, I think you have places like the Mosaic Project, the International Institute, who are very intentional and very vocal and saying that St. Louis is a great place to come. I think the question is, are there enough resources here to make it happen? But again, St. Louis is in competition with Dayton. They're in competition with Nashville, Charlotte, Las Vegas. These are all cities who are also saying we want them here in our city as well.
You just used the term, a phrase, population is power. And I guess my final question, unless we get more in the chat, would be, when does population cross over into being so large it's a debilitating aspect of a society and is not power, but is actually problematic?
That's a good question. I think it's when you get into like a cost of living, you get into cost of living where it's just so expensive to live in that region that you're getting selective out migration. So I think I look at Los Angeles, it's I think the latest numbers, it's 11 million people live in that region, in the Los Angeles metro region, which is not even including the San Bernardino part of it. But it's very expensive to live there. And so I think you get selective migration out. And people are always shocked when I say that Houston's more diverse than Los Angeles, because Los Angeles is becoming a Mexican city, because you have whites and blacks who are leaving the region. And so, and it's going to continue to become less diverse as the metropolitan region, partly because it's a very expensive region to live in. And people are saying, well, I'm going to try Phoenix, I'm going to try Orlando, Charlotte. So I think that would be, there's kind of a tension there though, because I do think what's going to happen over the next 30 years is people want to live in, maybe not the city, but they want to live in an urban area. And so we do see this, is that more and more people are living in an urban area because you want access to what it has to offer, from education, culturally, sports, and other activities. So I'm happy if people want to send me an email. I have a map of the United States by county of all these statistics. And you clearly see that there are going to be some winners and losers. I still think that, like, young people are still going to want to go to places like New York and Chicago, San Francisco. But then you have people who are like, well, I want to start a family. Maybe I'm going to move to Colorado Springs, or I'm going to go to Nashville or Austin. And so I think we're going to see a lot of shifting over the next 20, 30 years. I think the question is, what I get when I talk to local policymakers is, how do we get that migration here to St. Louis? And my number one answer is, if St. Louis wants to be a top 20 metropolitan region again, it needs to have a Latino population that's double digits, at least 10%, which means you need 300,000 Latinos in your region at a minimum. And so is it difficult to do this? No. What's the biggest impact? Well, part of it is the political rhetoric that's used to talk about these groups. And so you see in some of these other states like Tennessee and Nebraska, I would say these are very conservative states, but they have decided to embrace a rhetoric that's not as harmful to the Latino population. Nashville's got a Latino population that's twice as large as St. Louis, and it's smaller than the St. Louis metropolitan by 1 million people. Charlotte's got a population that's 3 times as large as St. Louis's.
Wow. And is affordable housing more accessible in those locations? I think that's the other piece of the equation that we could consider, right?
I think that there's more housing. I don't know if it's affordable. There's more housing being built in Nashville and Charlotte than in St. Louis. Yeah. Gotcha.
Great. Okay. Well, super. This has been a fantastic hour. I appreciate Dr. Sandoval, thank you for taking the time to join us, and everybody who also joined in from afar. I want to let you know about the next Great Decisions event on the Quad Alliance with Lieutenant General Kenneth Kunziker on April 7th from 4 to 5:30. We will also be hosting the German Consul General Wolfgang Mosinger on March 25th at 6 p.m. If you'd like to join us for either of these events, please see the chat for links to registration, and they should be appearing right now magically. So again, these programs can only happen because of the support of our membership. So please consider becoming a member of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis today. And with that, I will say, be safe, get outside. It looks wonderful. I'm clearly turning red here in the late afternoon sun on my video. And again, thank you, Ness, really good to see you as usual. And thank you for those wonderful questions, and the behind the scenes folks who are doing things right now as my hands are right here. So thank you to everybody, and have a fantastic and wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.